Well, if you're still here, you either have nowhere else to go or you really want to hear about expanded access. So I'm excited about that. Thank you, Kara. I appreciate that. What I'd like to do is get a sense of those of you, what your experience is with expanded access, for those of you here in the room and those online as well. So we're going to start with a poll question. For those online, when that comes up for you, you can get started. But for you here in the room, just see by raise of hands, how many of you here have ever submitted or been a part of submitting an expanded access application before? Yeah, I see a couple hands, one or two. How many of you understand the process, but you've never actually individually participated in it before? Hands again. How many of you at least are vaguely familiar with the terms, but you don't really know the process? Okay, a few more. And finally, how many of you just don't know what expanded access is, but you're here to learn? Okay, it's kind of a split. So we'll see what the online result was. Okay, great. Well, this is perfect then. We have an introductory presentation for those that don't know but want to learn. Actually, the reality is we'll be able to cover some things that hopefully will be helpful to those of you that are somewhat more familiar with expanded access, but in terms of some of the nuances, the minutia that you may not be as familiar with, it can hopefully help you the next time you go back to participating and submitting another expanded access application. So with that, today we're going to talk a little bit about why we have expanded access, what it is. We're going to talk a little bit about the regulatory foundation for it, what the legal pathway is that allows us to be able to provide this. And then we're going to, whoa, slides are cruising faster than I am. Let's back up here. There we go. We're going to talk a little bit about how expanded access works. We'll talk about in detail the differences between the categories. And let my slides catch up with me here. That's okay, no problem. Okay, and then finally, I will provide you with a list of online resources that you can go to learn some additional information about expanded access if you'd like to, and contact information where you could ask more questions. So to begin with, I want to talk a little bit about why we have expanded access. Why does this exist? In order to understand that, it's really important to first understand what the ideal is from the FDA's perspective. From the FDA's perspective, receiving an investigational new drug product is most ideal in the setting of a controlled clinical trial. And the reason for that is because it's in that setting that we can produce or have controlled data that can then be a part of a marketing application, which, if approved, from a public health standpoint, provides the broadest benefit and the most access, because at that point, any physician can prescribe that medication to a patient who they feel needs it. But having said that, we also recognize that there are instances where there's patients that have some diseases where they don't have access to clinical trials for a variety of reasons. Perhaps they live in a really remote location where it's just not feasible that they can access a trial. Or perhaps they don't meet the entry criteria. Or maybe there isn't even an ongoing trial for their particular disease. Perhaps it's a very rare disease. So in those instances, that is why we created and why we have the expanded access pathway, is for these patients to offer a potential alternative for treatment when they don't have any other alternatives. So what then is expanded access? Well, it's a regulatory pathway that allows for treatment of a serious or immediately life-threatening condition with an investigational product when essentially there's when there's no other satisfactory alternatives for that patient, when the benefit justifies the risk, and when the treatment does not interfere with clinical trials that could support approval. To just touch on that last point a little bit, if you imagine any given disease that you can come up with in your mind, there's always a finite pool of people that actually have that disease. And it's from that pool that we have to draw for our clinical trials. And so if you imagine taking away half or three-fourths of that pool of people and starting to provide treatment to them under access, then you've extremely reduced the number of people that are available to enter into clinical trials and help to get that product to approval for the broader patient access. So this is the reason why that's an important point. Also keep in mind that FDA is the one that makes the determination of whether or not the expanded access criteria are met, and product manufacturers are the ones that make the determination of whether or not they will provide the product. That's not something that FDA can coerce or require. It's completely up to the companies and the decision that they need to make. So, okay, so what's the regulatory foundation? Legally, how are we able to allow this to occur? Well, this kind of has a little bit of its basis back in the 80s. Many of you will remember the HIV or the AIDS crisis, when that was a fairly new disease and patients didn't have access to treatments. There just weren't any available at the time. At that time, in fact, in 1987 was when FDA first sort of formally recognized this idea of treatment access. And it was codified in Section 312. The thing with that was there was a little bit of ambiguity about some of how it worked, and we, over time, got feedback on that. And so then in 2009, the FDA published what we call the final rule for expanded access. And that essentially created 3 distinct categories for patients to obtain access to an investigational product under the expanded access paradigm. The first is what we call the individual, or sometimes you might hear it referred to as a single patient category. The second is called the intermediate sized patient population, IND or protocol. And the third is what we call the treatment IND or protocol category. And I'm going to go a little bit more into detail on these 3 throughout the presentation and help you to understand what some of the differences are between these, and it has more to do than you would think. It's more than just the numbers, I'll say that. So, okay, so with that, let's try to look at the details of these categories. I want to have you imagine for a minute that you, right now today, had a patient come to you. You're either a physician or perhaps a product manufacturer, and you've been approached and asked for help to get to submit a request on their behalf so they can get access to your product or a product that you would like to get for them. So how would you go about doing that? What are some of the things you would need to consider? There's some general elements that you would need to think about that apply to all of the categories of expanded access. And then there's also some specific elements that are unique to each of the individual categories. So we'll go ahead and start with the general elements. These are going to sound familiar from what we've already talked about, but essentially, one of the requirements is that patients must have, as I mentioned already, a serious or immediately life-threatening disease or condition with no comparable or satisfactory alternative. Also, they have to demonstrate that the potential benefit from this investigational product outweighs the potential risk. Also, they have to show that the risks are not unreasonable in the context of the disease or condition that's being treated. And finally, as we already touched upon, they have to demonstrate that providing access to these patients will not interfere or decrease the chances of success in any ongoing clinical trials that may be occurring for that product. So, some of the general safeguards that we have in place for all expanded access categories are that the sponsor must obtain informed consent from the patient. This was mentioned a little bit earlier, but basically the patient has to be aware of what the risks are and accept those knowingly and trade off for the potential benefit that they're going to be getting from this product. There has to be institutional review board approval. The sponsor has to meet the safety and annual reporting requirements just like they would for any other IND submission. They have to provide the investigator's brochure if it's available, and they're subject to the clinical hold provisions just like any other sponsor of an IND would be. And on this one, I'll stop on this point for just a second, because I think that, well, at least I've heard before in the public perception, there are occasionally there's this idea or this concern that if a sponsor were to participate or a product manufacturer were to participate in expanded access, that may somehow jeopardize their overall clinical development program. For instance, if there was an adverse event that occurred, it was really bad, they're afraid the FDA is going to shut the program down, and then that's it. They're out of luck. Well, it's not an unrealistic potential, right? But the FDA, there was a group of researchers actually in 2016, and it was mentioned again in a paper published earlier this year in 2017, where a group of researchers from the FDA, took a look at our data over the period of about a decade, okay, at all the expanded access submissions that we had come in. And that summed somewhere in the neighborhood of about 11,000 individual submissions, INDs, and protocols. And once treatment began with the investigational product under those submissions, there were only 2 that were placed on clinical hold. Okay, so that's a fraction of a percentage that were placed on clinical hold as a result of an adverse event that was seen during treatment with this product. And in both cases, those holds were resolved and the programs were allowed to continue. So hopefully that helps to dispel any myths or concerns that there's really not the liability that I think people tend to think by participating or making available during expanded access your product. So, in terms of submissions, the general requirements are very similar to what you're used to for INDs, right? I apologize for the small font, but I think most of you probably would know what it requires to submit an IND, and not dissimilar from INDs under expanded access. Sponsors can provide this information using a letter of authorization from the product manufacturer, which decreases the burden on them, and they can focus more on some of the other administrative details. Finally, again, because we're pretending we're preparing to submit one, I ask you to keep in mind that we ask you to clearly mark on the cover letter and on the 1571 that this is for expanded access. That flags it for us, and then we know how to immediately triage it and take it from there. So here's a picture of the lower half of the first page of the Form 1571, which you're probably familiar with. And on the bottom right is the area where you would indicate which of the categories of expanded access it is that you're requesting. You'll notice there's actually 4 boxes. That's not because I misspoke and said there's only 3 categories. It's actually because for individual patient access, we subdivide that into emergency use and non-emergency use purposes. So you might ask yourself, okay, well, now I know that there's different categories, but how do I decide which category I want to use? There's a couple of factors you want to ask yourself, okay? 2 really important ones. These aren't the only ones, but these are 2 pretty important ones. The first is very obvious. How many patients am I planning to treat, okay? And the second is, are you actively seeking marketing approval? From the FDA's perspective, what this really means, and this will come up again later as I talk about the individual categories, but what this really means is, have you completed your pivotal trials? So often we think of those as our phase 3 trials, right? Is enrollment in those completed? So your patients are no longer eligible to enroll because it's completed. The company's either actively preparing their marketing submission, either NDA or BLA, or they've already submitted it to the FDA, and now they're waiting to hear back on whether or not that application is approved. Okay? So if they're at that stage, that's what we consider actively seeking marketing approval. But beyond that, there's some other unique elements that help us to determine which of the categories we would go for. So we'll take a look at those now. So let's start with our first category, which is individual patient, again also known sometimes as single patient INDs or protocols. And just as the title indicates, this would be used whenever you're planning to treat an individual patient. It requires that the physician determine that the probable risk from the drug does not exceed the probable risk, or the risk from the disease that the patient has that they're intending to treat. And on the other hand, from an agency perspective, we take a look to make sure that there's not another open IND or protocol that we could inform the sponsor about, under which this patient could obtain access to that product instead. In terms of safeguards that are unique to the single patient INDs and protocols, treatment is generally limited to a single course or a defined duration. Now, there are exceptions to that. FDA can approve longer-term treatment, but it usually requires that the investigator or the sponsor provide a specific rationale and evidence of ensured safety over that time course, if that's going to be the case. The request, or the requirement, I guess, of the sponsor is that at the end of the time when they finish that course of treatment for the patient, we would like to get back a written summary of the results of that. How did it go? What was the effect on the disease? What were the adverse events that were seen? And we take a look and we review that. Now, if we did, for some reason, go ahead and extend the time that they could treat under a single patient IND, we most likely would institute or ask that special monitoring take place just to ensure the safety of that patient in the long run. And then finally, we do have the authority when we start to receive multiple individual patient INDs for the same drug, for the same treatment, to go ahead and reach out and ask that those all be consolidated into an intermediate size IND. And what that does is it decreases the administrative burden both on the sponsors and on us, and also really helps us to watch out for safety better as well. So in terms of submission elements that are unique for the individual patient INDs and protocols is this, what we call Form 3926. I mentioned the 1571 earlier. For those of you who've ever filled one out, you know what goes into preparing that and the information that it requires to go with that. We were hearing feedback from individual investigators or physicians that it was just too cumbersome. Right? They're not as familiar with the regulatory process, and this is just a lot of red tape. Why do we have to do this? It's not worth it. It's taking too much time. And as a result of that, we were hearing feedback that was actually blocking access to those individuals that those physicians wanted to treat. And so the FDA took that feedback and responded, and last year in June, we created and released a new form, 3926, and the purpose is to streamline the process for individual investigators applying for treatment on behalf of an individual patient. So commercial sponsors can't use this form, and it can only be used to request treatment access for an individual or a single patient. Okay? But when it is used for that purpose, it does streamline the process, and it cut the time for preparation now by our standard, or by our estimation at least, down to about 45 minutes. So if an investigator chooses to use this form, it's not a requirement, but if they choose to use it, the idea is it replaces the 1571 and the 1572 as long as they fill it out completely provide the letter of authorization from the product manufacturer, right? And then they provide the first few pages of their CV. Okay. This is just a snapshot of it. You can't see this. I didn't expect you to be able to, but it's an active link for those online that can download the slides. It should be active in there. But you could also just go into the Google search bar and type in Form 3926, and you would be able to. That would probably be your first hit, and you can take a look at what the actual fields are on that new form. To just touch a minute on the emergency use subset of individual patient INDs and protocols. This is for instances when you have a patient whose condition is so serious and treatment needs to be given so imminently that there's just not enough time to reasonably be able to spend even 45 minutes filling out a form, mailing it to FDA, waiting for a few weeks to hear back from us. And so in those instances, the regulations are reasonable, and they allow the physician or the sponsor to call us and request authorization to treat under emergency use conditions. As long as those conditions are met, we can then authorize that, again, over the phone. And by our own data, we show that we do this on average in the same day. There's very little lag time. So the caveat is that once we authorize that, the sponsors are required to send us back within 15 working days a written submission, like we already talked about, if they use a 3926 with those 3 elements that we discussed, and that allows us to have a record of what they requested. Finally, if you ever find yourself in a position that you need to do this, this is a link that will take you to our public website where you can find the numbers of individuals that you would call that would direct you to the right review division within the FDA that could consider your requests and either authorize or not. So to move to the second category of expanded access or intermediate size patient populations, this would be used if you were planning to treat more than a single patient, okay? And either the drug is not being developed for the treatment use that you want to use it for, or it is, but the patients you're planning to treat, for whatever reason, can't enroll in those ongoing clinical trials. In that case, we require that there's demonstration of sufficient evidence of safety at the proposed dose and at the proposed duration, and also some preliminary evidence, or at least a clinical, either preliminary clinical evidence or at least a plausible pharmacological mechanism that there would be an effect on the disease. In terms of safeguards for this category, the FDA performs an annual review on these particular set of INDs and protocols each year. And really the purpose for that is for us to determine whether or not treatment use should continue. Separate from or different from the individual patient INDs, which again, those were only for a single course of treatment other than in rare circumstances. These can be ongoing, but we do review them to make sure that they're appropriate to continue. So some of the questions that we ask are, if a clinical study is not being conducted for this use, for this expanded access use, could it be? Have conditions in the patient population changed such that it's now feasible to conduct a clinical trial? Again, with the public health benefit in mind that we want to get this out there for the broadest number of people. If we can get it to approval, then that's the case. On the other hand, if it is being developed or if there is an ongoing clinical study, are we pulling too much away from that available population for those clinical studies to enroll from? Okay. Finally, we take a look and say, is it still appropriate for intermediate size, or do we want to move over to a treatment IND or protocol? And I'll talk in a minute a little bit more about what the criteria are that would help us to decide that. On the sponsor's part, they're responsible for just ensuring that all their investigators are adhering to the protocol requirements and all of the applicable regulations, they're licensed, and so on and so forth. In terms of the submission elements that are unique to intermediate size, again, the sponsor just needs to provide a statement, or if you were a sponsor, you would just need to provide a statement of whether the drug is or is not being developed for the treatment use you're planning to use it for. And then an explanation of either why it can't be developed if it's not being developed, or if it is being developed, justification as to why those patients that you want to treat can't be enrolled in those clinical studies. Why is it that they don't meet the criteria? Okay. And then finally, a specific description of the patient population that you're planning to treat. Okay, the third category that we talked about, and we're going to look a little bit more closely at, is the treatment IND or treatment protocol. Again, you would use this for when you have multiple patients, and you or the product manufacturer are actively pursuing marketing approval of the product. We defined what that meant earlier, and this is why it's so important, because if you're not, you can't qualify for this category of expanded access. It does require that if you're planning to treat a set of patients that have a serious condition, that you demonstrate both safety and effectiveness. On the other hand, if you're planning to treat patients that have immediately life-threatening diseases, the risks from their disease are higher, therefore our bar goes down just a little bit, and you have to provide at least a reasonable basis for effectiveness without posing significant risk of injury. In terms of the safeguards, really the one unique safeguard for the treatment protocol or IND category is just that unlike any other protocol you'll ever submit, which you can go ahead with as long as you fulfilled two requirements, which you're familiar with from regulations. The first is you submit it to the FDA, and the second is that you've gotten IRB approval. With the treatment protocols, it's a little bit different. Historically, this was the category, actually, that I mentioned that was originally created back in 1987 with the idea that it would potentially provide broad access, or in other words, a large number of patients. And so because more patients may potentially be exposed to this investigational product, the FDA needs 30 days, just like they would for a brand new IND, to look at this treatment protocol and decide whether or not it would be safe to expose all those patients. So that's really the key safeguard there. In addition, sponsors, again, are asked to monitor for compliance with the protocol and applicable regulations. So in terms of then taking a look, we know that both intermediate and treatment INDs can be for multiple people. I think the single or individual patient IND is pretty clear. But you might ask yourself, okay, well, I have multiple patients, and which one of these do I use? It may already be clear to you, but I'm just going to hit on it and touch on it again to make sure that this point we drive home, because I think oftentimes we get lost on this because we see the names of them, individual, intermediate, treatment, and we think, oh, it's all about the numbers. The reality is it's actually not, at least for these two. Our own guidance points out that the regulations don't impose a specific numerical limitation on either of these categories. Okay, so what it really boils down to is A, am I developing, or is the product, if not me, is the product manufacturer developing the product for marketing? And if they're not, it doesn't qualify or can't qualify for treatment category. Therefore, by default, it would be the intermediate size category. On the other hand, if the product is being developed for marketing and the sponsor is actively pursuing marketing application, as we defined earlier, for the treatment use that you want to use it for, so for the same reason that you'd like to use it for the same indication or disease you want to treat for, then regardless of the number of patients, it would be or qualify for a treatment IND. Okay? This visual is to kind of give you a little bit of a feel for the volume of expanded access submissions that CDER alone receives each year. So on the x-axis, you have the fiscal year starting back in 2010, showing you data for the last 7 fiscal years. And on the y-axis, you have the number of individual expanded access submissions that we receive, either IND or protocols in any of the 3 categories that we've talked about. Okay? The areas of the bars, portions of the bars that are highlighted in blue are represent those expanded access requests that FDA, or excuse me, that CDER allowed to proceed. In other words, treatment was allowed to move forward. The portions of the bars highlighted in red, which you may have a hard time seeing, represent those that were not allowed to proceed. I think you get the point here, right? That is that on average, CDER allows greater than 99% of all requests for expanded access to proceed. I think this is an important slide to focus on for just a moment, because again, to just pick up on something that I hear often in the public domain, there's this perception that FDA is this bad actor that stands in the way between patients and getting access to medications. I think this data shows it's actually not true. FDA really recognizes the benefit of this program, and we try our best to adhere to the criteria, and as long as you do the same, then there's a high probability that you'll be able to provide access to the patients you're trying to treat. So, in summary, we've talked a little bit about why we have expanded access, what it is, the regulatory foundation for it, a little bit about how it works, and then in terms of helping to understand the difference between the 3 categories, how we differentiate between those and which one of those you would want to use if you were to choose to be a sponsor. And then finally, I mentioned I'd provide some links to some additional resources that you could go to for learning more about expanded access if you think this is something you'll ever encounter in the future. Also some contact information. Our Division of Drug Information and our Office of Health Constituent Affairs are those who you would normally call if you had an emergency IND, and they would direct you to the appropriate division, as well as the landing page on our public website that is dedicated to providing more information on expanded access. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop there, I think, and take any questions that we have.
All right, as per usual. Thank you. we've got a couple questions online. And if you have questions here in the room, please feel free to step up to the microphone. And while we wait for that, for people to make their way up, let's go ahead and take our first online question, please.
Okay, it's a long one, so bear with me. Can you clarify what phases of an IND are typically seen for each subset of an expanded access request? For instance, do you see mostly that have gone through phase 2 studies or just starting phase 3 for a specific or some type of indication clinical endpoint? And how many for individual patients versus treatment group, et cetera, et cetera? It would be helpful to understand the most common types requested, if they are granted, or if you refuse, i.e. 50%.
Okay, so that is a long question.
I can repeat if you need.
No, that's okay. I think there's 3 or 4 questions in there. I'll do my best. If I get off track, you can bring me back on. So I'm going to start by saying we're very careful not to limit the phase of development that these can be used in. They can really be used other than the treatment, right? That one's very clear. You have to be actively pursuing marketing and application in order for that one to be applicable. But for the other ones, right, it boils more down to the number of patients and is the product being developed or not. So we try to not limit the phase of development to when you can request these, if I understood the question correctly. I think another part of the question was the ratio of the 3 different categories and what we see in terms of numbers. You actually can go onto the FDA's public website, and we have those numbers posted for the past, I think, similar, I think 2010, if I believe that's actually where I got that data from. And I didn't break it out here because I didn't have time in the presentation, but just to give you an idea, by a long shot, we receive far more individual patient requests, either emergency or non-emergency, than we do either intermediate or treatment. Obviously, treatment, because it's really limited to that, to bridge that gap between when pivotal clinical trials have closed and you haven't yet received approval, that's a pretty narrow window, and there's not every drug that gets to that point. So by far, we receive the fewest treatment INDs and protocols, and by far, we receive the most individual patient INDs, emergency and non-emergency. Was there another question there that I missed? Or did that cover it?
I think that covered it.
Okay.
It was an online question, so yes.
Okay, great. All right.
And for the folks online, sorry. But please, if you have any questions, type them into that Q&A pod, and we'll get to them. In the room, if you have any questions, raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone along. Can we take our next online question, please?
Can a pharma company charge for the drug under expanded access? Is it perceived that they need to give it away?
Yes and no, right? That's my answer to those 2 questions. So yes, they can charge. FDA has to authorize it, so they have to submit a charging request to the FDA. In most instances, we ask that they just charge basically whatever their cost is to make the drug. There's some concerns in there probably from a sponsor standpoint that means in some ways they have to reveal their cost for the drug, so there's reasons why they may choose to not want to do that. But yes, they can make that request. As long as FDA approves it, then they can go ahead and move forward with that. And the second question was, is there a perception that they need to not charge? I mean, not from the FDA's perspective. I don't know. I can't speak for any of the patient advocacy groups or, from a patient perspective, but the FDA doesn't come down on either side of that. That's completely up to the pharmaceutical companies.
Okay, another online question?
Can you comment regarding the CMC requirements of an expanded access IND versus a traditional IND?
They're the same. That's why we suggest that sponsors use the letter of authorization route, because the same information that's required for traditional clinical study in terms of product quality, manufacturing information, supporting non-clinical information, it's all there for expanded access as well. But in most cases with expanded access, you're talking about a drug that has already begun in the development process where the product manufacturer or the sponsor, their intent is to head toward marketing eventually. And so they have all that data in their file. And if the expanded access sponsor can obtain a letter of authorization from them, what that essentially does is allow FDA, we can see the data no matter what, but for proprietary reasons, we can't look at that data on behalf of the expanded access sponsor unless we're authorized to by the owner of that proprietary information. So we point out that the LOAs are there as a means and a tool to use.
Any questions in the room? Any other questions online?
Yes, we have a few more.
Okay.
The next question, do you need at least some toxicology data on the drug for allowing the expanded access? In other words, how do you establish that the patient benefits are higher than the disease effect?
So that's a great question. So again, I would answer, I think that's very similar to the one that we just answered. The standard or the requirement for providing non-clinical data would be the same as for a regular IND. Obviously, if there's preliminary clinical evidence, it's just the same as if you're applying for a brand new IND. You can have, if you've done studies outside the US, not under IND, and you have preliminary clinical evidence that you can demonstrate safety in humans with that, you can submit that instead of non-clinical data. Otherwise, you have to fulfill those non-clinical data requirements. And again, we either do that ourselves, meaning as a sponsor, or we reach out to someone who has that data and ask for permission for the FDA to reference that information on our behalf. So.
Okay. Next online question, please.
Okay. What is needed on the label? Is an expiration date required?
So this is just like any other investigational product. The regulations require that it be labeled as for investigational use only, but recognizing even though it's being used by the physician for treatment. In terms of expiration dates, I would assume that they would have, again, the same requirements, you know, that there's probably some sort of stability data that's been generated, and the company has labeled that to show the shelf life commensurate with whatever stability data they have. So.
Okay. Do we have another online question?
Yes. Can you clarify further what CMC information is needed in the LOA from the drug product manufacturer?
So the LOA doesn't have specific CMC information in it. It just allows us to reach out to the CMC information that's already existent in the product manufacturer's file. And again, the requirements for CMC information, they're outlined in the regulations, and it's just the same for expanded access as it is for a regular IND. It's just, again, you can just as you could for regular IND, you can supply that to FDA by getting a letter of authorization. So letter of authorization is really just, for those who don't know, it's just a cover letter, right? That's written from the product manufacturer and sent in directly to FDA to their own IND, and just says we authorize Dr. So-and-so to refer to our, to the CMC, or they don't even really specify. It can be anything within their file that we need in order to determine product quality and safety, and to say we authorize FDA to reach back to our file, and reference that on behalf of this individual physician.
Next question, please.
Could you talk a little bit more about the expanded access navigator's role?
Sure. So I will start out by saying I'm not an expert on that. I was not involved in the creation of that, but I am familiar with it. That came about in collaboration with the Reagan-Udall Foundation, which is a collaborator with the FDA. It's a nonprofit organization that often helps FDA implement initiatives. And so they created a website, essentially, that is intended to provide both patients who are interested in obtaining expanded access, as well as their treating physicians, kind of a single source of information where they can go with questions, and also to find out who, there's links on the website, is my understanding, that will take them to individual drug products for different indications, or sponsors' websites where they can find information on whether or not a given sponsor or drug product has an expanded access program available. So that and then it can walk them through the steps that they would need to take to reach out and go ahead and submit a request ultimately to FDA to request access to that product. So it's essentially a information warehouse for expanded access.
Okay. Up. And as I take the microphone over to the person in the room, can we take the next online question, please?
Does the manufacturing site need an FDA inspection history prior to expanded access being approved?
Okay, let me repeat that, make sure I got that. It sounded like the question was, does the product manufacturer have to have been inspected by FDA prior to us approving expanded access for that product? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I think the answer is probably no. I don't think we treat it like an approval. Again, I think we have to remember what we're talking about here is, again, INDs and protocols. And there's not a lot of differences in terms of the way that we look at the expanded access versus normal INDs and protocols. The only difference is what's the intent, okay? So if you were allowed to put an investigational new product into a patient without FDA going out and inspecting it under a normal IND, same thing applies for treatment, right? As long as you have sufficient evidence of the product quality and all of the CMC and manufacturing information that you would expect to see under a normal IND.
All right, let's go to our question here in the room, please.
Thanks. So an expanded access sponsor is supposed to submit annual reports
Yes.
to the FDA, adverse event reports. Does that information get shared by the FDA back to the product sponsor? And if not, can the product sponsor require that the expanded access sponsor send them those same reports?
Okay, I think I have your question. Let me see if I can repeat it and get it. Okay, so let's take adverse event reporting. That's kind of where you're focusing in on. And you're asking if the expanded access sponsor provides an adverse event report to us under the conditions in which they're treating, can the product manufacturer, or the commercial sponsor, if you will, can they get access to that adverse event?
Right,
report?
either from the FDA or can they require it from the physician as well?
That's a good question. I would think that as the product owner that they would have access to that. Now, the exact mechanisms of how we do that, I'm not sure, and I'd be happy to get back to you if I can get your information afterwards and let you know. But I think that the FDA is not in the business of hiding information. We're in the business of protecting proprietary information. But as the manufacturer of that drug product, there's no reason why they shouldn't know. I just don't know the exact mechanism of how they get it. Whether the expanded access sponsor, shares that with them at the same time as FDA, or what that exactly looks like.
And we're almost out of time. I know you had a couple follow-up thoughts you wanted to share to wrap up.
Quickly, go ahead. Yeah, just quickly, this is my personal contact information if you have any other questions about what we've talked about today, specifically in this presentation. And then finally, just a reminder from the FDA's perspective, from a public health standpoint, the ideal for investigational products to be received really is in the context of a clinical trial, because it could lead to approval, which provides the broadest patient access and benefit in the end. However, we realize that's not always available, so that's why expanded access exists. And if you ever are interested or anyone approaches you about participating in expanded access, just remember that, at least speaking for CDER standpoint, we do authorize greater than 99% of all the submissions and requests that come to us. So you have a fairly good chance of being allowed to move ahead with that. So with that, I appreciate your time and thank you.
All right, thank you, Paul.